So let's talk about float. So float is a concept in HTML that allowed documents to add images or add small snippet of content and float them to the left or float them to the right. For instance, if you might have in a book or an article, we have lots and lots of text, a piece of image, and then more text, and then image. One of the things you might want to do is to have an image maybe on the top corner, top left corner, yes, and then the text just somehow like wrapping around that image, yes. Or you might want an image to be on the right hand side, yes, and then the text just wrapping around that image. So that can be achieved in HTML by floating images left or floating images right. Make sense? Right. So basically, you have text, 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 float image left, text, 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 float image right. Right. And what it'll do is that as the text progresses, it'll bump the left image to the right hand side, and right after the content of that image, whatever text follows, just follows along right next to the image, right, and it just wraps around it. It's a nice little example uh, uh, um, that can be used to implement things such as columns and rows, right? It's to be implementing the grid system, right? If you remember early last week when we talked about the tables, we talked about that HTML when it first came out. It was mostly for rendering research papers, yes, where you have an abstract, or you have an intro, and the methodology and conclusions, yes. That was the main audience. That was the main target audience. As it was started to be used by many more folks, certainly we started looking at other ways that we could lay out content, right? And certainly we started copying other industries such as the printing industry that had been printing magazines and newspapers for quite a while, and they have the accumulated wisdom that usually long pieces of content are easier to read if you lay them out in columns. Yes. So we would want to have the same kind of thing in HTML documents. So at first, well, there is no support. There's no native support in HTML to accomplish columns, right? Side by side content. There's no support for that. So at first, folks were using tables to accomplish this, and as I mentioned earlier, it's considered today a bad practice. You would not use tables to accomplish it, even though you would achieve it, right? You would lay out things in columns. Instead, tables are meant to only for tabular content, right? For headings and columns that have the same data in each column. Yes, you would not use tables for that. Instead, we're gonna hijack the float mechanism that used to be used for it was meant to be used by images, right? To float things left and right and whatnot. So if you hijack that mechanism, we can implement a grid system, something that looks like tables and rows, but doesn't use tables and rows. Okay? All right, so how do we do this? So take a look at this example. We have two paragraphs, right? They're rendering like normal blocks, right? They render from top to bottom. They added some spacing, some vertical spacing. All right, so let's see when we start floating these guys. All right, so notice that what we're doing here, we're saying take those two paragraphs, right, and we're going to add float left. See that? This says style float left 50%, float left 50%. We already know what width does, right? Width, well, the example we saw earlier was width 100 pixels, I believe. Yes. You can also use percentages. You can say I want the width of this element to be 25 or 50% of whatever the parent is. Yes. So we already know that the width will just make them smaller horizontally. But what does the trick here is float. Float left says, well, you go find yourself on the left hand side, and everything else is just going to wrap around you. Yeah, that's what float does, right? It removes you. You no longer behave like a block element, right? Now you start behaving like an inline element, right? And everything that is next to you is going to start wrapping around you, right? So if you keep doing this, we could certainly take two paragraphs, float them both left, right? And now you have columns. See that? That's how you would you would use a best practice of using not tables, right? Instead using CSS to achieve columns. 50%, 50%, you have the two columns. Notice that they still are behaving somewhat like blocks, right? Notice that the height, right? The height changed, yes? The height is always going to be, if it's a block, it's still going to be given by the content that is inside of the block. Right? The width, the height definitely grew. Right? Over here, the height was only 4 lines, whereas now it's 8 lines. Right? It was now it's 50%. It's 50%. It's twice as tall, half as wide. If we go further, and instead of 50%, we go 33%. Right? Notice that we have now. Excuse me. We have the style, the float left, but now the width is 33%. We could maybe have enough space to add another column right next to it. See that, right? So this is the mechanism that Bootstrap uses, right, to implement the grid system, right? It allows you, it declares the following classes: column 1, column 2, column 3, all the way to column 12. Right? And what it does is that it uses percentages. So column 1 is going to take since by convention it says, well, I'm going to break up the page into 12 equal parts. That means that each unit is going to be 1/12, right? The overall width, right? So whatever that percentage is, 1 over 12. I don't know what's that. Is 8%? I don't know. 2/12, right? That's 16%. Da 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 da. And this is 12 over 12. That's 100%. And then these columns, you can grab these columns and then you paint your paragraphs or your divs, and they take those percentages. Make sense? Right? That's how they achieve all those columns. Right? But this one last thing is that when you style an element to be float, everything else floats, right? And wraps around that. At some point, you want to maybe stop floating. You want to go back to the original behavior, right, of adding, just be a normal block again. Yes, right, where you just add vertical spacing. So to do that, you want to say, okay, these guys are floating, but at some point, I might want things to just render normally. Right? You need to be able to stop floating. Right, and so to do that, there's a style called clear both. So clear allows you to stop floating, right? If you were floating left, you could say just clear left. If you were floating right, you can just say clear right. To be safe, you can just say clear both, right? Yes. I don't know. I'll always use both, but let me try that. Yeah. And so clear both is exactly what dot row does, right? Dot row allows you to break up and say, well, this is one row, right? One row, and then I stop, and then becomes, so that's why you typically have a div with class row, right? And then inside, you have another div with class column 2, right? And then all the divs inside, right? That's why you have an outer row and then lots of columns inside. Make sense? Right, the row clears the float, right, and then all the ones inside float, that many together. All right.